Hi class, it's Mrs. Luke. We're going to be reviewing Chapter 9, the nervous system. So here's the learning objectives of the nervous system. List all the organs and divisions of the nervous system and describe the generalized functions of the nervous system as a whole. Identify the major types of cells in the nervous system and discuss the functions of each. Identify the anatomical components of a reflex arc and explain its function. Explain the mechanism of transmission of a nerve impulse along a nerve fiber and across the synapse. Objective 5. Identify the major anatomical components of the brain and spinal cord and briefly comment on the functions of each. Compare and contrast cranial and spinal nerves. Discuss the anatomical and functional characteristics of the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. I did mention cranial nerves in the review for 1, 5, and 6, and it's very interesting to see the difference between the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, how they react and what their functions are. It's an amazing thing what the cranial nerves do in your body. And the anatomical and functional characteristics of these two divisions. Really intricate, and we've got a lot of things to learn in this chapter. The organization of the nervous system. There's the central nervous system, which houses the brain and spinal cord, and then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is PNS, and that's all the nerves, and the autonomic nervous system, which is abbreviated ANS. Okay, first we're going to talk about neurons. Neuron structure. Each neuron consists of three main parts. The cell body of the neuron, the dendrites, which are branching projections that conduct impulses to cell body of a neuron, and the axon, it's an elongated projection that conducts impulses away from the cell body of the neuron. So types of neurons. There's classifications according to function. Sensory neurons, they're afferent. They conduct impulses to the spinal cord from the brain. So an example of that would be, I'm thinking about picking up a cup of coffee with my hand, and my brain tells my hand muscles to grip the cup of coffee. Motor neurons are efferent. That conducts impulses away from the brain and spinal cord to muscles and glands. Afferent, which I just said incorrectly, afferent conducts impulses to the spinal cord and the brain. So in other words, forgive me for that error. In other words, afferent, let's say I pinch my finger in a drawer and it causes pain. That pain impulse is going to go via nerve route to my brain saying, my finger hurts. I hurt my finger. Do something to stop the pain or pull the finger out, whatever it is. Efferent is conducting impulses away from the brain and the spinal cord to the muscles. So if I, like I said, as the example incorrectly for afferent, I want to pick up a cup of coffee, so my brain tells my muscles and my nerves in my hand to go into a gripping motion and pick up that cup of coffee. Interneurons conduct impulses from sensory neurons to motor neurons or among a network of interneurons, also known as central connecting neurons. This diagram shows how the efferent and afferent neurons work, where one goes from the brain to the body and the other one goes from the body to the brain. Cells of the nervous system. Glia, neuroglia, they're support cells bringing the cells of the nervous system tissue together structurally and functionally. There's three main types of glial cells of the central nervous system. There's astrocytes, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. You need a linguistics degree to really pronounce some of these words, so bear with me, students. So astrocytes are star-shaped cells that anchor small blood vessels to neurons. So they're kind of, these are tissues helping connect things together. Microglia are small cells that move in an inflamed brain tissue, carrying on phagocytosis. I would like each of you to look up the definition of phagocytosis and drop that into our discussion with a definition. So I know that you've looked it up. You're going to be hearing phagocytosis quite a bit. Oligodendrocytes, they form myelin sheaths on axons in the central nervous system. This myelin sheath is a very important entity. These myelin sheaths protect the axons and neurons and cells in the central nervous system. And there are certain diseases that debilitate these myelin sheaths, damage them. Sometimes someone is born without them. So make sure you know myelin sheaths. Schwann cells form myelin sheaths on axons of the peripheral nervous system. Nerves and tracts. Nerve bundles of the peripheral axons. We've got tract bundles of central axons. We have white matter of the brain, which is tissue composed primarily of myelinated axons, nerves or tracts. We have gray matter in the brain, which is tissue composed primarily of cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. So those fibers are not protected by a myelin sheath. Nerve coverings, that's fibrous connective tissue. So we have endo, peri, and epi. Endoneurium surrounds an individual fibers within a nerve. Perineurium surrounds a group of nerve fibers. And epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. So all three of those make sense as endo, peri, meaning many, and epineurium means surrounding all inclusive. So let's talk about nerve signals, students. So we have reflex arcs, okay? Their nerve impulses are conducted from receptors to effector over neuron pathways or reflex arcs. Conduction by a reflex arc results in a reflex. Examples of that are contraction by a muscle or secretion by a gland. The simplest reflex arc are two neuron arcs consisting of sensory neurons synapsing in the spinal cord with motor neurons. Three neuron arcs consist of sensory neurons synapsing in the spinal cord with interneurons that synapse with motor function. Please look at figure 9.5. It'll make a little bit more sense to you once you look at the diagram and reread the slide. Nerve impulse. Definition of a nerve impulse. Self-propagating wave of electrical disturbance that travels along the surface of a neuron membrane, also called action potential. I would remember action potential in the definition of action potential. That might be one of those test questions. Mechanism of a nerve impulse. At rest, the neuron's membrane is slightly positive on the outside, polarized from a slight excess of sodium ions on the outside. A stimulus triggers the opening of the sodium ion channels in the plasma membrane of the neuron. So a nerve impulse, mechanism of a nerve impulse. Its inward movement of a sodium ion depolarizes the membrane by making the inside more positive than the outside at the stimulated point. This depolarization is a nerve impulse. That is the action potential, students. Make sure you know this. The stimulated section of the membrane immediately repolarizes, but by that time, the depolarization has already triggered the next section of membrane to depolarize, thus propagating a wave of electrical disturbances, depolarizations, all the way down the membrane. Continuing nerve signals. The synapse, the place where impulses are transmitted from one neuron to another, the postsynaptic neuron. Please look at figure 9.8 in your book in chapter 9. This may help give it a better understanding by looking at the process in a diagram. Synapse made of three structures: synaptic knob, synaptic cleft, and plasma membrane. I would note that could be a test question. Neurotransmitters. They bind to a specific receptor molecule in the membrane of a postsynaptic neuron, opening ion channels and thereby stimulating impulses conduction by the membrane. Last of the nerve signals, neurotransmitters are chemicals by which neurons communicate. Acetylcholine, catecholamines, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. These catecholamines, norepinephrine is a CNS stimulant. Dopamine is a natural neurotransmitter in the brain that keeps your blood pressure up. It's a stimulant. And serotonin is a relaxing mechanism, chemical in the brain. And cephalines, nitrous oxide, and other compounds. Now moving on to the central nervous system, the divisions of the brain. We have the brainstem, which includes the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, which houses the hypothalamus, thalamus, and pineal gland, and then there's the cerebrum, spinal cord, coverings, and fluid spaces. So let's talk about the brainstem first. It consists of three parts of the brain, and it's named in an ascending order: the medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. This structure is made of white matter with bits of gray matter scattered through it. It's kind of back in the base of the brain. Functions. All three parts of the brainstem conduct impulses to the higher parts of the brain. One of the main things that the brainstem controls is your breathing. If the brainstem herniates, that is probably a 100% mortality situation for an individual. The cerebellum. The structure is made up of a second largest part of the human brain. It's made up of gray matter on its outer layer, which is thin but highly folded, forming a large surface area for processing information. Arbor vitae, internal tree-like network of white matter tracts. The functions of the cerebellum are: it helps control muscle contractions to produce coordinated movements for maintaining balance, moving smoothly, and sustaining normal postures. Variety of additional coordinating effects, assisting the cerebrum and other regions of the brain. Diencephalon. This is the hypothalamus. It consists mainly of the posterior pituitary gland, pituitary stalk, and gray matter. It acts as the major center for controlling the autonomic nervous system. Therefore, it helps control the functioning of most internal organs. It controls hormone secretion by anterior and posterior pituitary glands. Therefore, it indirectly helps control hormone secretion by most other endocrine glands. It contains centers for controlling body temperature, appetite, wakefulness, and pleasure. As I said in the previous chapter review, all of these things are interdependent, and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and all involved here have a huge effect on a lot of the body's functionality. So let's talk about the thalamus. It's a dumbbell-shaped mass of gray matter extending toward each cerebral hemisphere. It relays sensory impulses to the cerebral cortex, sensory areas, and in some ways it produces the emotions of pleasantness or unpleasantness associated with sensations. So if you're walking out in cold wind and it's hitting you in the face, and that sensation is an unpleasant sensation, chances are that your thalamus is helping make that decision that this is not a pleasant experience. The pineal gland, the pineal body, it's a small body resembling a pine nut behind the thalamus. It adjusts output of time-keeping hormone, melatonin, in response to changing levels of external light, sunlight, and moonlight. So now, students, let's talk about the cerebrum. It's the largest part of the human brain. The outer layer of gray matter are the cerebral cortex. It's made up of lobes, composed mainly of dendrites and cell bodies of neurons. Interior of the cerebrum is composed mainly of white matter. There's tracts of nerve fibers arranged in bundles, and basal nuclei, and that's islands of gray matter, regulate automatic movements and posture. Functions of the cerebrum: mental processes of all types, including sensations, consciousness, memory, and voluntary controlled movements. Sometimes an early symptom of a brain tumor, if it's affecting or invading the cerebrum, you might have somebody actually thinking that they're being touched or they're feeling sensations that aren't really existing, and this is probably one of those symptoms that you need to do a brain scan on this person to really make sure that there isn't an invading brain tumor starting. I left this diagram in the PowerPoint presentation. They're really hard to view. The font is so small. But on page 185 in your book, diagram figure 9.10 has a beautiful picture of the cerebrum and where it lies in comparison to all the other objects in the brain, but it just shows the magnitude of the cerebrum. So now let's talk about the spinal cord. Columns of white matter composed of bundles of myelinated nerve fibers form the outer portion of the H-shaped core of the spinal cord. Bundles of axons called tracts. The interior is composed of gray matter made up mainly of neuron dendrites and cell bodies. And we talked about that at the beginning of this chapter where it seems so intricate, but it really comes down to what the functions of all of these cells and neurons and axons do to help really with the nervous system. So the interior is composed of gray matter made up mainly of neuron dendrites and cell bodies, as I just described. Spinal cord tracts provide two-way conduction paths, ascending and descending. So ascending sends nerve conductions up, messages up, and the descending send the messages down. The spinal cord functions as the primary center for all spinal cord reflexes. Sensory tract conduct impulses to the brain, and motor tracts conduct impulses from the brain. So to the brain, from the brain. Spinal cord is absolutely an essential, and when it's severed, that is a real disaster. Here's a great picture of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Please look that up in your book on page 190. It's an amazing picture of all the levels and all the structures of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. And I gave you the wrong page. I saw a picture of the cerebral cortex on 185, but the cerebellum, the cerebrum rather. The really great diagram of that is on page 188. So 188 for the cerebrum and 190 for the spinal nerves. So let's talk about coverings in the fluid spaces of the brain and spinal cord. The coverings are cranial bones and vertebrae, cerebral and spinal meninges, the dura mater, the pia mater, and the arachnoid mater. Fluid spaces, the subarachnoid spaces of the meninges, the central canal inside the cord, and the ventricles in the brain. On page 191, it shows a great view of the coverings of the spinal cord. So now let's talk about the peripheral nervous system, the cranial nerves. I've always been so intrigued with the cranial nerves. So there's 12 pairs of them, which means there's 24 cranial nerves attached to undersurface of the brain. They connect the brain with the neck and structures in the thorax and abdomen. Spinal nerves, 31 pairs, which consist of dendrites, of sensory neurons, and axons of motor neurons. So all those neurons and axons, it's all coming forth to all these structured systems. Conduct impulses necessary for sensation and voluntary movements. Dermatome is the skin surface area applied by a single cranial or spinal nerve. Of the cranial nerves, I know it's hard to see on a slide, but please go to page 193. It shows you exactly which cranial nerve is involved with which area, the olfactory nerve, the eye. It's just really an amazing system, and the genius of cranial nerves. So 193. So let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. Functional anatomy, autonomic conduction paths, sympathetic division, parasympathetic division, autonomic neurotransmitters, and autonomic nervous system as a whole. Functional anatomy. It consists of motor neurons that conduct impulses from the CNS, central nervous system, to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue, regulates the body's autonomic or involuntary functions. Preganglionic autonomic neurons conduct impulses from spinal cord or brainstem to an autonomic ganglion. Postganglionic neurons conduct from autonomic ganglia to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. Autonomic or visceral effectors, that's tissue to which autonomic neurons conduct impulses. The sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Okay, I left this diagram. It's an innervation of major target organs by the autonomic nervous system. Please refer to your book to page 196. It shows you where all these nervous system, autonomic nervous system functions happen. The eyeballs dilate and constrict. We secrete saliva. We stop secretion. This is the sympathetic nervous system. Our bronchi dilate, speeds up the heartbeat, secrete adrenaline, decrease secretions, decrease motility, retain colon contents, delay emptying. And then the parasympathetic nervous system constricts bronchioles, slows down the heart rate, increase secretion, increase motility, empty the colon, and empty the bladder. So please review the diagram 9-19 on page 196. Okay, class, we're going to talk about autonomic conduction pathways for a minute. So it consists of two neuron relays. An example is preganglionic neurons from the CNS to autonomic ganglia synapses, postganglionic neurons from the ganglia to visceral effectors. In contrast, somatic motor neurons conduct all the way from the central nervous system to somatic effectors with no intervening synapses. So let's start with the sympathetic division. There's the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So let's talk about the sympathetic first. Structure. there's dendrites and cell bodies of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons that are located in the gray matter of the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. Axons leave the spinal cord in the anterior roots of spinal nerves, extend to sympathetic or collateral ganglia, and synapse with several postganglionic neurons whose axons extend to spinal or autonomic nerves to terminate in visceral effectors. So the visceral effectors are sending messages. A chain of sympathetic ganglia is in front of and at each side of the spinal column. So let's talk about the functions of the sympathetic nervous system. It serves as the emergency or stress system controlling visceral effectors that send out messages during strenuous exercise and when strong emotions like anger, fear, hate, or anxiety are triggered. Group of changes induced by the sympathetic control is called the fight or flight response. Now this fight or flight response will be on your test. You may see differentiation questions between the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system. There have been situations where somebody's all of these things go to open your bronchioles, increase your heart rate, pump more blood to all your organs. There's many things. Epinephrine's pumped out to give you more energy to run. There was a story years ago when I first became an RN where a portion of a car fell on this mother's child trying to change a tire or something of that effect. Her sympathetic nervous system kicked into the point where she had enough strength to lift that car and get her child out. So, if somebody's chasing you and you're running, or if you're in a part of the water which are over your head, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, helps you breathe better, helps you give you energy, give you movement, help you try to get out of that situation. So it's the fight or flight response, which all of us have experienced in our life from as young an age as 4 or 5 years old. So know that, students. Okay, students, so let's talk about the parasympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic division, which is the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. So the structure is a parasympathetic preganglionic neurons have dendrites and cell bodies in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral segment of the spinal cord. So here we go. Dendrites, cell bodies, all of this stuff intermixed, intergrowing, and interfunctioning in this nervous system. Terminate in parasympathetic ganglia located in the head and the thoracic and abdominal cavities, close to visceral effectors. These effectors are messengers. Each parasympathetic preganglionic neuron synapses with postganglionic neurons to only one effector. The functions of the parasympathetic division dominates control of many visceral effectors under normal everyday conditions and counterbalances the sympathetic function. So let's talk about the autonomic neurotransmitters. Cholinergic fibers, preganglionic axons of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems, and the parasympathetic postganglionic axons release acetylcholine. Look up acetylcholine, look up the function of acetylcholine so you know what that is. That's going to be a little assignment. Adrenergic fibers, that's axons of sympathetic postganglionic neurons, releases norepinephrine, noradrenaline. So I also want you to look up norepinephrine. So please post definitions of acetylcholine and norepinephrine in our discussion section. Almost finished with this, guys. We're close. So last slide. Autonomic nervous system as a whole. It regulates the body's autonomic functions in ways that maintain or quickly restore homeostasis. We discussed homeostasis in the beginning of 1, 5, and 6, and this word and this function will go along all the way through your nursing studies. Homeostasis is where we want the body to be. Many visceral effectors, which are messengers, are doubly innervated. Example, they receive fibers from the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions and are influenced in opposite ways by the two divisions. So there you have it, folks. That's the nervous system. Lots of information. You've been very patient to go all the way through this. We'll make sure that we review, kind of not exactly what's on the test, but the kind of questions. Do the pre-test, do the post-test. That will make you learn what the questions are going to be all about. Do the test behind the chapter. Don't look up the answers until you've taken the test. And the answers that you missed, make sure you go back and relearn them. You guys are the best.